China's global rise is often explained through its factories, its massive workforce, or its explosive economic growth. But behind all the two usual explanations lies a quieter, far more strategic engine. A financial strategy that allows China to expand influence across continents without firing a single shot. It's a strategy built not on armies, but on loans, infrastructure, and long-term dependency, creating a level of geopolitical leverage that many nations did not see coming until it was too late. This strategy is now widely called China's debt trap, but the true story is deeper, more complex, and far more revealing about how modern power works. Today, we uncover how China uses debt not simply as financing, but as a geopolitical weapon, one that the world was never supposed to fully see. Beginning in 2013, Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, known as BRI, the most ambitious global development program in history. China announced that it would fund ports, highways, power stations, fiber optic cables, airports, and railways throughout Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. At its peak, China pledged over $1 trillion in investments and loans, a figure larger than the entire Marshall Plan when adjusted for inflation. By 2021, more than 140 countries had signed on to BRI projects, and China had become the world's largest official creditor, surpassing the IMF and World Bank combined in new international lending. But BRI loans were different from traditional Western loans. Western lenders often required reforms, transparency, anti-corruption measures, environmental safeguards, and economic restructuring. China required none of these. Instead, Chinese loans were typically bilateral, negotiated quietly between Chinese officials and local elites, often with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the public from knowing the real terms. Many contracts required that projects use Chinese workers, Chinese companies, and Chinese materials, meaning a large portion of loaned money flowed straight back to China's own economy. And crucially, many of these loans were backed by collateral strategic assets such as ports, mines, or natural resources, which China could seize or control if a country could not repay. The most famous example of this happened in Sri Lanka. In the early 2000s, Sri Lanka wanted to develop Hambantota, an underused port on its southern coast. Western lenders and the Indian government declined, calling the port commercially unviable. China stepped in and financed the project with loans totaling more than $1.3 billion. But the port struggled to generate revenue. Sri Lanka fell into debt distress. And in 2017, the government agreed to hand over a 70% stake in Hambantota Port to China Merchants Port Holdings on a 99-year lease. Sri Lanka also granted 15,000 acres nearby for a Chinese-controlled industrial zone. While China denies this was a deliberate takeover, the result is undeniable. China gained control of a key port sitting near one of the busiest shipping routes in the Indian Ocean. Critics say this is the clearest example of debt trap diplomacy. China argues that Sri Lanka mismanaged funds. The truth sits somewhere in between. The port was risky, the loans were large, and the political consequences proved enormous. But Hambantota is not an isolated case. In Pakistan, China invested more than $60 billion in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, including the deep-sea port of Gwadar. Pakistan's debt to China soared, and by 2023, more than one-third of Pakistan's external debt was owed to Chinese lenders. In Zambia, after years of borrowing from China for roads, hydropower stations, and airports, the country defaulted on its debt in 2020, with nearly $6 billion owed to Chinese institutions. In Kenya, public concern grew over rumors that the country's largest infrastructure project, the $4.7 billion Nairobi-Mombasa Railway, funded by China, could place the port of Mombasa at risk of Chinese takeover if Kenya failed repayment, a claim both governments denied. But leaked documents in 2018 showed that Kenya had indeed used the port as collateral for at least part of the railway loan. In Laos, Chinese loans for dams, highways, and railways have pushed debt to more than 65% of GDP, and by 2021, Laos handed majority control of its national electric grid to a Chinese state company after struggling to meet repayment obligations. In the Maldives, Chinese loans increased from virtually zero in 2010 to more than $3 billion by 2018, equivalent to roughly 30% of the country's GDP. In Montenegro, China financed a major highway project that became the most expensive per-kilometer road in Europe, leaving Montenegro with debts so high that it sought help from the European Union to refinance. And in Djibouti, a tiny nation located near one of the world's most important shipping lanes, Chinese loans surged to more than 70% of the country's GDP. In 2017, China opened its first overseas military base there, a move many analysts warned was enabled by debt dependency. All these examples share the same pattern: large Chinese loans, opaque contracts, infrastructure with limited commercial returns, and increasing political leverage for China when countries struggle to repay. But what exactly does China gain from all this? First, access to strategic ports and trade routes. Ports like Gwadar, Hambantota, and Djibouti sit near key choke points in global shipping. Control here allows China to ensure energy security, project military influence, and challenge traditional powers like the United States and India. Second, long-term diplomatic loyalty. Countries heavily indebted to China often support Chinese positions in the United Nations and other global institutions. Studies from aid data found that countries receiving major Chinese loans were significantly more likely to vote in alignment with China on international resolutions. Third, resource access. Chinese loans often secure rights to mines, oil fields, and rare earth minerals. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chinese companies gained long-term mining rights in exchange for infrastructure loans. In Angola, China structured oil-backed loans, allowing repayment through future oil deliveries. Fourth, economic power. Chinese companies, especially state-owned enterprises, win the majority of BRI construction contracts. In many countries, Chinese workers and firms dominate the projects, reinforcing China's economic footprint and boosting its own industries. Fifth, global influence and a rewriting of the financial order. China's lending model presents an alternative to the Western IMF-style system. Many countries frustrated with structural adjustment policies turn to China because the loans come fast, with fewer political conditions, but those same loans often create long-term dependency. Critics call this a trap. China calls it partnership. But both sides acknowledge one reality: the influence China gains is enormous. However, China's strategy is not flawless. Many BRI projects have struggled financially. A 2022 aid data report estimated that 35% of BRI projects faced major problems like corruption, environmental violations, or disputes. Several countries, including Malaysia and Myanmar, renegotiated or canceled Chinese projects after concerns over cost and sovereignty. And most importantly, China itself now faces an economic slowdown. Its property sector crisis, declining population, and rising domestic debts are forcing Beijing to scale back new lending. In fact, by 2023, China's annual overseas lending had dropped more than 50% compared to its peak in 2016. China is no longer the bottomless lender it once was. Meanwhile, receiving countries are increasingly resistant. Nations like Zambia, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan have demanded restructuring, delaying payments, or reducing interest. China has found itself, for the first time, managing large-scale debt crises abroad. This was never originally part of the plan. But here is the surprising truth. Many experts now argue that China never intended to trap countries in debt. Instead, China expected projects to pay for themselves. Ports would generate trade. Railways would boost industry. Power plants would fuel growth. But economic reality did not match Beijing's expectations. Many projects failed to generate revenue, leaving China with billions in risky, distressed loans. Yet even if these were not originally traps by design, the political outcomes often function like traps. When a government becomes financially dependent on a single creditor, that creditor gains influence regardless of intent. China's opacity, secret contracts, and strategic collateral only intensify that dynamic. So, is China deliberately trapping countries in debt? The evidence is mixed. But is China using debt to expand power and influence? The evidence is overwhelming. The Belt and Road Initiative has rewired global economics. China now holds more than $1.1 trillion in overseas loans. More than 60 countries owe China over 10% of their GDP. In at least 16 countries, Chinese debt exceeds 20% of national GDP. And across dozens of nations, China has secured strategic control over ports, pipelines, grids, and natural resources. Western nations are finally responding. The United States, Japan, and the EU have launched alternative programs, like the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure, to counter China's influence. But these efforts are years behind and lack the scale China has already deployed. Meanwhile, China continues to adapt. It is shifting from big infrastructure loans to smaller, more profitable investments in telecommunications, digital finance, and green technology. Huawei dominates African telecom networks. Chinese surveillance systems operate in more than 80 countries. China is building digital payment systems, satellite networks, and cybersecurity infrastructure across the developing world. The debt trap is evolving, moving from physical infrastructure to digital dependency. Nations might not lose a port, but they may lose data sovereignty. And that might prove even more powerful. Today, the world stands at a crossroads. China's lending has slowed, but not stopped. Many countries remain deeply indebted. Western powers are pushing back. The future of global development is being rewritten. But perhaps the biggest lesson is this: modern empires are not built with armies. They are built with financing. China realized this earlier than anyone. Loans became influence. Infrastructure became leverage. Dependency became power. And through it all, China reshaped the world quietly, strategically, and with a patience that few nations could match. Whether you see China's strategy as visionary or predatory, cooperative or coercive, one truth remains: this is the global strategy no one was supposed to see. And now that the world finally sees it, the geopolitical landscape will never be the same again. If you found this breakdown of China's global financial strategy eye-opening, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves history and economics, and subscribe to HistoriNomica for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Your support helps us continue exploring the hidden financial stories behind global events. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.